Hello, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to introduce you to the Crucible through the concept of MacCarthyism. So this is just part one. We're going to be talking about what was MacCarthyism and who was this gentleman, Joseph McCarthy, that it was named after. Now, Joseph McCarthy was part of American politics during what was known as the Second Red Scare. Now, this was a time during the 40s and 50s when people became really afraid of the Reds, which was the communists. Then the communist threat was growing throughout Eastern Europe and all throughout China, and this fear that it was going to spread and even take over and conquer the United States. Now, this was a pretty deep-seated fear and led to a lot of nervousness and paranoia, not unlike what happened in the country after 9/11, when everyone was convinced that there were going to be bombers and terrorists underneath every seat and looking out every window. At the end of World War II, America became in this rivalry with communist Soviet Union. Now, during World War II, we'd actually been rivals with the Soviet Union, but afterwards, we got into what became known as the Cold War. So this wasn't an actual war where we were exchanging gunfire and troops on the ground and all of that, but it was this arms race where each group was trying to get better technology and more weapons than the other. And this created really an international, it spread across Europe, not just the United States and the Soviet Union. And then in 1950, when communist China began to expand, this became yet another idea of the Red Scare, that the communists were just taking over everything everywhere. A lot of these were fueled by development of the nuclear bomb and the idea that now that everyone had bombs, that, or actually the United States had bombs, and we'll see Russia was about to get bombs too, that we were under a threat of attack just at any particular moment. We were all going to end up in this giant mushroom cloud. So as I was saying, they had this real sea change about the way that we felt about the Soviet Union. During World War II, we were allies, we were on the same side, we were working together. And after that, the Soviet Union put up the wall in Germany, and then as they expanded their territory, they started taking over these neighboring countries. And that's when the Cold War and these fears about communism and communist takeovers really began. One particular thing that really freaked out Americans was when the Soviet Union was able to successfully test an atomic bomb in 1949. And not only was this scary that another country besides us had nuclear weapons, but the fact that it came much earlier than our analysts had expected. So it said this fear, like, what else are they capable of? What are they working on that we don't know about? In this very same year, Mao Zedong gained control of mainland China. Even though the United States was actually backing the opposing forces, we had this huge communist revolution and takeover in this enormous country. And if all of that wasn't enough, in 1950, the Korean War began. And this was the United States and the United Nations again, and the South Korean forces against the communists who were supporting North Korea and China on that side. So we've got all of these factors sort of combining to make the United States really, really afraid that communists were in our country and were going to be working for the downfall of the United States. And so this is where we find our play is set. We're going to talk a little bit about this political situation behind the writing of the Crucible. So we know this term MacCarthyism. Let's start where it came from. So who was Joseph McCarthy? Well, he started out as a really great guy, Marine Corps veteran, fought in World War II, elected to the United States Senate, and he was from Wisconsin, and he began his career as a senator in 1946. While in the Senate, he became one of the most powerful and feared men in the United States. He learned how to build off of this paranoia that we were getting about communists getting into this country and to exploit people's fears. And anyone who spoke out against him, all he had to do was turn around and point at them and say, well, you must be supporting the communists, you must be a member of the Communist Party. And this would become career suicide for this particular person. He even went so far as to start a banning in the libraries of novels that he decided were anti-American. And at his height, he wielded this amazing amount of power and fear. In February 9th of 1950, he made this famous speech where he took out the sheet of paper and he waved it around saying, "I have in my hand a list of known communist loyalists who are working right now in the State Department." And this just set off this firestorm that the communists were actually, there were communist spies and people working against us right in our very own government. Now, Congress already had something called the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, and that had actually begun in the 1930s as an anti-Nazi kind of organization, and then had morphed into an anti-communist organization, which was designed to look for evidence of communist infiltration and communist leanings in the United States. So these investigations began where people after people kept being called in, and the question that was always asked is, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party of the United States? And that was the dreaded question. Now, after a short time, HUAC started to expand its investigation, and instead of just dealing with the State Department and the government, they started looking at Hollywood. And they said, you know, all of these people out there, they're writing movies, and they're directing these plays, and they're bringing things in, and I'll bet that they're members of the Communist Party as well. And one by one, they started to bring these folks in and to question them about their suspected membership in the Communist Party. So among the first 10 people from Hollywood that were called in were a group of witnesses that said, you know what, we are not going to cooperate with you, and we're certainly not going to give you the names of other people. Even if we want to talk about our own work or things with Communist Party or communist leanings, we refuse to give you the list of names of other people who might have been at the meeting, other people who might have asked us questions about it, or anything like that. And for those of you who are playing along at home, this is where you're going to tell me about pumpkin pie tomorrow morning. So pumpkin pie is your little Easter egg for this video to show that you've been listening as we go. So these particular 10 witnesses were the ones who said, you know what, we are not going to cooperate with you. We refuse to turn in our friends. Now, this wasn't just a noble thing to do. There were some real-life repercussions. These people were put in jail. They were called in for contempt of Congress, and then they were also blacklisted, and no one in the film industry would hire them or work with them until the 1960s, so for about 10 years. If you can imagine being an actor or a writer or a director and having to take a 10-year break from your entertainment career, the kind of damage that that would do. Now, McCarthy and his committee weren't content with just bringing in people and asking them questions. They were actively working out there in the world to wield their influence. There were books that were banned that McCarthy said, well, these are anti-American, or they were written by anti-Americans. And some libraries actually even burned the newly forbidden books. So ironically, this group that had started off with the HUAC being an anti-Nazi party was now just adopting some of the same behaviors that we saw the Nazis use under Hitler. At the height of his influence, Joseph McCarthy decided a new target, and this was investigating people who were in the Army. He started this story, investigating the story that there was a spy ring among the Army researchers, and he was really kind of digging in this, but nothing was really coming out of this at all. This was no evidence that was coming in, and it was really not going anywhere with this particular investigation. Now, these Army McCarthy hearings began with, again, McCarthy investigating Army personnel, and also started with a series of insults that were directed at this brigadier general. And this led to a series of very formal hearings that did not start off on a good foot with the HUAC committee and, or the HUAC and McCarthy's committee there, and with the generals from the Army on the other side. Now, this was the 1950s, and television was just starting to really gain an influence. Not every American home had a TV at this point, but many of them did. And these Army McCarthy hearings were broadcast. And on this broadcast, McCarthy came off in people's living rooms on their TV screens as cruel and paranoid and suspicious about all these things. And public opinion really started to turn against Joseph McCarthy. And this is where McCarthy actually fell to the ground here. After about 36 days of these nationally televised hearings, it was becoming really clear to the American public that McCarthy had no evidence, that he was just essentially being a bully. And there's a famous quote where one of the generals finally says to him, or it says, "You've done enough. Have you no decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" And at this point, the public had no use for McCarthy, and on television, he'd come off so badly, and McCarthy's career was really pretty much over. So after the lead counsel for the Army had called on this "have you no decency" Senator McCarthy, and finally it was an end, in less than a year, McCarthy was done. And in 1954, the Senate actually voted to censure, which is to kind of scold him in a way, but even so, it was pretty bad, by a vote of 67 to 22. And he was one of the few senators that's ever been disciplined by their own legislative body. And Joseph McCarthy actually died about 3 years after this, in May 2nd of 1957. He was only 48 years old. The official cause of death was listed as acute hepatitis, but most people who knew him also suggested that he had been an alcoholic, and of course alcoholic and hepatitis are affecting the liver, and that this was part of his cause of death. So that's the end of part one. Hopefully you have a little bit more understanding of who Joseph McCarthy was and what it is when we refer to MacCarthyism, this idea of a kind of a witch hunt atmosphere with lots of false accusations and suspicion and paranoia. Part two tomorrow is going to look at how Arthur Miller became connected with Joseph McCarthy and what became the motivation for writing writing Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. And that's the end.